This won't be about chivalry or banners or the sentimental myths built around straight steel. This is about form, and the moments when form stopped obeying symmetry and began answering to pressure, angle, and fear. Among the first to reshape that conversation was the flamberge, a sword whose wavering edge seemed to burn even in still air. Each curve a distortion meant not for beauty, but for interruption. Its undulating profile forced the eye to track motion inaccurately, pulling attention sideways, unsettling the rhythm of defense. When such a blade met armor, it did not land cleanly. It arrived with a stuttering, dragging vibration that made shields tremble and gauntlets tighten as though the metal itself recoiled from the touch. Each wave introduced a slight lateral twist, splitting the moment of impact into multiple smaller shocks, loosening the resistance of plate and sending the force snaking along edges that were never meant to receive it. In close ranks, its passage through air felt wider than the blade truly was, carving hesitation into the space between bodies, breaking posture before it broke skin. And when it scraped along a shield rim, the sound that rose wasn't a clash, but a rasping, uneven tremor. The kind that unsettled even seasoned fighters who had learned to trust straight, predictable steel. Yet as Smith studied the violent elegance of such disruption, they began to understand that a blade could be shaped not only to strike, but also to release, to pass through flesh and armor without anchoring itself to either. And from that insight emerged a new family of edges cut not in waves, but in purposeful absences. That understanding led to the notched blade, a design that seemed at first glance like a flaw in the forging, as though the steelmaker had misjudged the mold and left hollowed segments where continuity should have been. But those deliberate recesses lightened the weapon without weakening its spine, turning mass into maneuverability and making the blade glide through motion with a deceptive ease. More importantly, each notch worked like a channel, a narrow escape route for the fluids that often trapped smooth-edged swords in the resistance of flesh or padded armor. Instead of catching, the blade slipped free with unsettling efficiency, leaving the wielder untouched by the hesitation that doomed many in the crush of melee. These voids along the edge disrupted the uniformity of impact as well, distributing force into uneven points that could worry open weak seams in armor or chain without requiring a perfect angle. And because the notched blade encouraged a rhythm of quick, almost surgical strikes rather than heavy cleaving swings, it found a natural place in formations where soldiers moved shoulder to shoulder, and every second of delay rippled outward into danger. There was no grandeur in its design, no flourish to impress onlookers. It was a tool shaped by necessity, a reminder that sometimes absence could be more dangerous than presence. Yet as infantry began to rely on speed more than mass, another curved answer rose beside it, a shape that guided motion not through hollows, but through the quiet geometry of a single sweeping arc. And in that growing reliance on speed, the footman's saber emerged as a natural extension of the body rather than a burden of metal. Its subtle curve was not an aesthetic indulgence, but a calculated answer to the reality of close formations, where straight blades often struck and stalled, losing momentum against armor or bone. The saber redirected force into a slicing trajectory that demanded less strength but yielded deeper results, turning each swing into a continuous motion that encouraged the soldier never to stop moving. In the cramped geometry of infantry lines, where shields pressed forward and bodies locked together, this curved blade carved narrow corridors through the chaos, slipping between defenses with a fluidity that straight steel could rarely match. The weight concentrated near the tip lent it a quiet authority, allowing even a modest strike to land with decisive intent, while the spine remained sturdy enough to parry without collapsing under pressure. It was not the sword of solitary duels, but of collective momentum, a weapon that lived in the rhythm of marching steps and coordinated thrusts, in the cadence of battles fought not by individuals, but by the rolling advance of entire ranks. And as armies realized how elegantly a curve married motion to purpose, horsemen who lived by speed alone demanded a longer, more sweeping answer of their own, a blade that could read the language of the gallop as easily as the infantry saber read the crush of the line. From that need for even greater reach and fluidity emerged the shashka, a blade that seemed almost weightless in the hand, yet carried the full momentum of a charging horse within every stroke. Its long, uninterrupted curve did not negotiate with the air. It cut through it as though the gallop itself were sharpening the edge. Unlike swords that relied on guards or elaborate hilts, the shashka trusted the purity of its line. A stripped-down silhouette shaped by riders who understood that anything unnecessary became a liability when the ground raced beneath hooves. Its balance favored the draw cut, the sweeping strike delivered in a single passing motion, a kind of kinetic handwriting written across the space between horse and foe. Where infantry sabers worked within the tight cadence of marching ranks, the shashka thrived on the expanding geometry of the charge, rising and falling in arcs that mirrored the rhythm of the animal beneath its wielder. The lack of a pronounced crossguard freed the wrist to rotate without constraint, making the blade feel less like an object and more like an extension of the rider's intent, able to change direction mid-swing with startling precision. And yet, its elegance concealed a ruthlessness. The long curve allowed it to bite deeply on contact, dragging its edge across surfaces that straight blades merely tapped. But as steelmakers observed how a single shift in geometry could command wind, muscle, and momentum, they began to experiment with shapes that broke the curve entirely, replacing flow with jagged interruption. Serrations meant not to glide, but to seize. Thus appeared the serrated blade, a weapon that abandoned the smooth conversation between steel and motion, and instead embraced disruption as its guiding principle. Where curves sought continuity, the serrated edge sought resistance, each tooth a deliberate interruption jutting forward like a promise of entanglement. These protrusions were not crafted to slice cleanly, but to drag, to anchor themselves in the seams of armor, leather, or shield rims, and pull the opponent off balance with the crude honesty of a tool meant more for tearing than cutting. In the push and shove of melee, where bodies collided before blades did, this jagged profile became a quiet predator, catching what was meant to deflect it and twisting the geometry of the shield wall into something unstable. The serrations redistributed force into multiple sharp points, concentrating impact where armor was weakest, and when the blade withdrew, it did so with a wrenching motion that unsettled both flesh and footing. Its rhythm in combat was not fluid, but syncopated, a series of stutters that forced opponents to adapt to a tempo they had never rehearsed. And while such a blade lacked the elegance of the shashka or the swift finality of the saber, it possessed a psychology of its own, the kind born from the knowledge that once caught, one might not be released cleanly. From this philosophy of pressure and entanglement grew heavier designs, forged not for finesse, but for overwhelming presence, where even the hint of curvature served not speed, but the blunt authority of a two-handed strike that pressed against shields like a rising tide. From that growing fascination with pressure rather than precision emerged the wavy great claymore, a massive two-handed blade whose gentle undulations seemed almost out of place on a weapon built for dominance. Yet those subtle waves were not decorative. They altered how force traveled through the steel, redirecting the violence of each swing into a broader, more destabilizing impact. When such a blade descended upon a shield, it didn't simply strike, it pressed, spreading energy across shifting points that made a defender feel the weight not as a single blow, but as a sustained, crushing insistence. The long grip allowed the wielder to guide the blade like a lever, turning each swing into a negotiation between gravity and human strength, and the waves along the edge induced a faint vibration upon contact, rattling shield frames, numbing wrists, and eroding the certainty that defense could hold out for long. This claymore was never meant for quick engagements. It belonged to the slow, grinding encounters where lines met and refused to part, where shields locked together like walls, and only relentless pressure could create a breach. Its presence altered the geometry of the battlefield, forcing opponents to shift, brace, and compensate, draining their stamina long before the decisive blow landed. And as blacksmiths observed how shape alone could manipulate not just armor but the posture and confidence of those who held it, they began to blur boundaries between weapons entirely, merging functions once kept apart, and crafting blades that carried the weight of axes but retained the reach of swords. So the forge turned toward hybrid answers, and the axe sword emerged as a deliberate violation of categories that had once seemed absolute. It carried the forward mass and brutal chopping authority of an axe, yet its elongated edge extended the reach and precision expected of a blade, creating a weapon that struck in two languages at once. The widened head near the tip delivered a cleaving shock that could shear through shields or split weakened armor plates. But as the stroke continued, the thinner trailing edge allowed the weapon to pull free without the clumsy recovery that burdened true axes. Its balance felt strange at first, top-heavy, insistent, almost impatient. But in trained hands, it became a pivot point for unpredictable angles, enabling strikes that began like sword cuts and ended with the concussive weight of an axe. This duality reshaped confrontations, forcing enemies to second-guess whether the incoming arc would bite, chop, or carve, and that uncertainty alone fractured defensive timing. In close quarters, it behaved like a tool engineered for interruption, overwhelming parries by combining momentum with concentrated mass, while in open exchanges, its elongated profile allowed it to threaten from farther than any axe could dream. But as smiths studied this merging of forms, they realized there was still room for something more experimental, a geometry broken into segments, each shift and angle designed to force armor to fail along its weakest lines, turning the blade itself into a moving series of pressure points rather than a single continuous edge. From that ambition to turn disruption into a principle rather than an accident, emerged the segmented sword, a blade that seemed almost engineered rather than forged, its length broken into subtle angles and recessed planes that guided force along a path no straight edge could imitate. Each segment shifted the direction of impact by a fraction, creating a cascade of micropressures that probed armor for structural weakness, exploiting any place where rigidity met tension. Instead of one clean strike, the segmented blade delivered a sequence of small mechanical insults, each bend in the profile urging the metal beneath it to flex in directions it was never shaped to endure. In the hands of an experienced fighter, it became less a cutting tool and more a moving stress test, a wandering fault line searching for the moment when a plate would buckle or a chain link would twist out of cohesion. Its geometry made even glancing blows dangerous, for the irregular edge caught and redirected with unpredictable severity, pulling armor askew and forcing defenders to compensate with awkward, draining movements. This was not a weapon of elegance or speed, but of inevitability, the kind that eroded certainty one jolt at a time. Yet as strange as its fractured silhouette appeared, it inspired another design that embraced fluidity instead of rupture. A blade shaped not like broken stone, but like something alive, curling and swaying as though drawn from the movement of a creature, rather than from the logic of metal. Thus took form the serpent blade, a weapon that abandoned the rigid geometry of straight lines and the jagged interruptions of segmented steel, choosing instead the unsettling grace of a continuous, living curve. Its undulating profile was not the showy ripple of the flamberge, but a deeper, more fluid motion, as if the blade had been coaxed rather than hammered into shape, each wave guiding the strike into a longer, more penetrating arc. When it traveled through the air, it seemed to slide rather than cut, the changing contours accelerating the draw cut as though the blade were tightening its grip on the space it passed through. On impact, those shifting curves distributed pressure across a widening path, allowing the edge to burrow deeper the longer it stayed in motion, turning even brief contact into a tearing glide that left armor deformed and cloth unraveling in uneven spirals. The serpent blade played with perception as well. Its shape made the exact point of contact difficult to predict, pulling the opponent's anticipation a fraction off-center, enough to sabotage timing and turn a confident parry into a misjudged flinch. In combat, it felt almost alive, its rhythm strangely organic, mimicking the unpredictable sway of something that had learned to hunt by redirecting attention before striking. And from this mastery of deception, through form, arose one final design, a blade that borrowed the language of illusion more boldly still, not through movement or curvature, but through the quiet suggestion of an edge that was not there. From that fascination with misdirection grew the false edge blade, a weapon that appeared at first glance to offer two cutting lines, its spine shaped to mimic a second sharpened edge without actually bearing one. This illusion altered the opponent's reading of distance and angle, forcing them to defend against threats that never fully materialized, while the true edge arrived from a quieter, more economical trajectory. The false spine allowed for feints so fluid they barely distinguished themselves from real strikes, its tapered geometry guiding the wielder's wrist into subtle rotations that made the blade seem to pivot in midair. In the chaos of a clash, this ambiguity became a pressure of its own, eroding confidence, inducing overcorrection, and opening narrow, unguarded spaces where even a light cut could alter the course of the moment. It was a design born not of force but of psychology, the notion that a blade could wound long before it touched, simply by reshaping expectation. And as all these strange silhouettes, the wavering, the notched, the curved, the jagged, the segmented, the serpentine, the deceptive, gathered through the centuries into a quiet lineage of experiments, they left behind no grand doctrine, no triumphant legacy, only the steady reminder that steel was never just steel. It was a shape waiting to be chosen, a path carved through air and intention, a brief geometry that lived only in motion and disappeared the moment it stilled, leaving behind nothing but the memory of how it moved.